I'd like to begin the sessions right now with our first speaker. This is somebody that I had the opportunity to meet at the Reforming the Family Justice services that they have. I had a chance to sit with him and really get an idea of how passionate he is about the topic that he's going to be speaking to right now. So Georg Stratmeyer lives at the intersection of conflict and language most of the time. The question he's interested in is this: do words shape what we think, or do our thoughts shape the words we use to express them? His presentation is about implications of letting words influence our ideas, thoughts, and narratives. Georg Stratmeyer, everybody.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. It's kind of unnerving to talk to an empty room. So can I get some volunteers to go out there and round them up for me, please? I'll just start anyways. So when I say that I live at the intersection between conflict and linguistics, what I mean is that as a mediator, I listen to what people say. And as a linguist, I listen to how people say it, right? And so what my talk is going to be about is just a little bit on the how. What my point here is that when, probably you've noticed by now, and I need to wait a little bit for my nerves to settle, so I'm comfortable here. Okay. I'm German, so English is a second language for me, and one of the things that happens to you when you learn another language is you have to go beyond the word lists and the grammatical rules. You also have to become an expert at how native speakers modulate meaning. And so what I mean by that is that native speakers have this intuitive way of expressing meaning that nobody teaches you at school. And so I made that my research project. I'm going to be talking a little bit about how that happens and why that happens. I'll give you some patterns and examples of those. And finally, I'll have a call to action for you. So the how. John Heritage is a writer in discourse analysis. He says that speakers have two tasks. One is progressivity, and the other one is intersubjectivity. Great words, right? Don't make any sense. Progressivity is about moving a conversation forward. When you attend a party and somebody asks you, what do you do for a living? And you say, I'm a mediator, then they'll tell you about the dispute they have with a neighbor, right? So this is moving a conversation forward. Intersubjectivity is about creating a shared meaning. You know you're in trouble when you're at that party and they ask you, what do you do for a living? And you say, I'm a mediator, and they start to tell you about their meditation practice. So in our culture, we give a preference to progressivity. We're a 24/7 society. We're hyper-connected. It's about doing things, and it's about doing them now, right away. Intersubjectivity falls by the wayside. We have this tendency to just do it to a level that's good enough for the purpose of the conversation. So, all right, here. So here are some patterns. My first example is actually from South African comedian Noah Trevor, who now works in America. And he does this piece about how Americans use English compared to how South Africans would use it. And so what he notes is that if you're in America and you want to identify a subgroup of Americans, what you do is you add a descriptor. So you'd say Latin Americans, you'd say Asian Americans, you'd say African Americans. But you don't do that for European Americans. You just say Americans. So my question to you is, how can you have a discussion about race relations when the language you're using to have that discussion already includes the privilege, right? It embeds the privilege by itself. You're privileged if you don't require a descriptor. The next example is about using metaphors. So this is John White. The context is a cessation of Quebec from Canada. And what he said was, 1,000 acts of accommodation are the fabric of a nation. So just let that sit for a minute. 1,000 acts of accommodation are the fabric of a nation. To me, as a new Canadian, I just love that, right? Because being a Canadian is an active process. I got to do something to be a Canadian. In contrast, all the rights of being a German citizen have been conferred to me just by the mere fact that I was born to German parents. So what that means is I didn't need to do anything, right? The problem with metaphors is that they're limited. If you're thinking about, the fabric of a nation, the example would be the Canadian flag that can be unifying. But a fabric can also be divisive if you think about the niqab, for example. The next example is about abstraction. I'm sorry, my clicker doesn't work as well as I'm hoping it would. My next example is about abstraction. So what we do is we start to utilize ways of distancing ourselves from what we are talking about. So an example is, what was the quote? None is too many. The quote is attributed to Frederick Blair, who was Director of Immigration Services of Canada at the time. The date is June 9th, 1939. The ship is the SS St. Louis, and the harbor is Halifax. Now, none is too many is the response of the Canadian government to the Jewish refugees on that boat fleeing persecution in Nazi Germany. And notice how I added Nazi to differentiate myself there. So what happens is when we start to use abstractions, we don't awaken the compassion that in this case, the Jewish refugees deserve. So in our modern context, we're talking about the civil war in Syria. So over 6 million people have been displaced by that. And now, Canada is willing to accept 25,000 Syrian refugees. All these numbers don't mean anything, right? But the image of Alan Cardy, that 3-year-old boy who drowned, got us all motivated, evoke our compassion. We wanted to be part of finding a resolution to this issue. The next example is about shifting from agency to attention. So the example is from a good friend of mine, Alan Waite, and his partner Kathy Richardson from the Center for Response-Based Practice. Think about a domestic violence incident. Let's name the participants Bob and Sue. So Bob is the offender and Sue is the victim. There are a number of ways of describing that scenario. One is Bob hit Sue. Another one is Sue was hit by Bob or Sue was hit. Now, if we say Bob hit Sue, following conversations will be about Bob and what we can do to prevent Bob from doing this again. Intervention programs, anger management, laying charges, and I did have the opportunity to teach some anger management skills in a domestic violence program. It was a fascinating experience for me. Now, if you say Sue was hit, subsequent conversation will be about Sue. And in the best case scenario, we'll talk about support services for Sue. What can we do to help Sue in this situation? At a worst case scenario, we will talking about behavior changes for Sue, right? She should leave him, for example. Now, I think that's a worst case scenario because she isn't the agent here, she's the victim. There's no need for her to change her behavior. She doesn't deserve that. But the reason that happens comes from some research that Gray and Wegner did, and they say that people have a hard time seeing somebody both as an agent and a victim. If you're an agent, you're deserving of praise and blame. If you're a victim, you're deserving of compassion. So if we say Sue was hit, we're replacing agency with attention because now we're talking about Sue, but we're still applying the same principle. Obviously, she's not deserving of any praise, so we're starting to think about blame, right? And that's a pattern that we have in the way we speak. Final example is Bart Norming. I used to live in the Cowichan Valley for about 25 years, and the Cowichan Valley is a community about an hour north of Vancouver Island, an hour north of Victoria. It has the largest Aboriginal population in BC, and so there's a lot of interest in that community. And I participated in two community studies, research projects on social indicators. And they showed that Aboriginal high school students, one of them showed that Aboriginal high school students have really poor graduation rates, around 50%. The other one showed that Aboriginal parents make for poor parents. They don't sing enough with their children, they don't interact enough with their children, they don't read enough to their children. These studies are just indicating a correlation. They're not talking about the reasons why that might happen, but the pattern of repeating these studies, and there are many like this out there in our community, indicate that there is some sort of a connection. And this norming process is a shortcut to connect a particular group of Canadians with particular social outcomes in a negative way. And what that does, it takes us away from thinking about, why this would be. So what these patterns have in common is that they give direction to a conversation. They lead us down a particular path as we're having this discussion. And when you're walking down a particular path, that automatically means that you're not walking down the other options that you have available to you. Now, in the words of Albert Einstein, you can't resolve problems with the kind of thinking that created them. So what you need to be aware of is, when I'm here in this mediation, am I excluding possible ways of resolving this? So the relevance to mediation is that the tendency to progressivity, directing a conversation, and the good enough principle that we apply to in order to be efficient creates an environment in where we have direction, and that's the problem. And so what I'd like you to do is think about your next mediation. When things are going really well, you're moving forward, you're achieving consensus, everybody's in agreement, chances are you missed the boat on something else that you could have done. So take that as a warning sign, sit back, and think about doing it differently. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Georg.
So,
that's great. I'll take that from you as well.
Okay.
So, Georg, you've obviously done a lot of research into this and a lot of searching. So how long have you been involved in this topic, and where do you plan on going with it?
Well, I did my master's at Royal Roads University, and when I started to think about my research project, I couldn't come up with anything. So my friend Alan Wade, who is a discourse analyst, said, "Why don't you do that?" And it was a bit of a trick question because I didn't know anything about discourse analysis at the time. Since then, I've become really excited about the topic, and I find that it has really improved my mediation practice considerably. I'd like to do a PhD eventually, and my current research project is what I call the bullshit register. It's about responsibility mitigating language, and once I got that ready, I'll be back.
Perfect. Are there any other questions from the crowd for Georg? Perfect.